In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the function of organizing. What we see here on this screen is an organizational chart. An organizational chart is a visual representation of the structure that we have in an organization. The way this works is these lines here show the reporting relationship. So we see that the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer reports up to the Chief Executive Officer. We see that these lines connecting the Quality Control Supervisor and the Production Supervisor mean they report up to this Vice President of Manufacturing. What we're going to be talking about in this chapter are all the different elements that make up this structure. The book defines organizing as the process of deciding how to best group our organizational activities and resources. So when we talk about our resources, we're talking about our human resources as well as informational resources, physical resources, all the resources we've talked about previously. As we go through the chapter, we're going to be looking at these main elements. They all have to center around how we organize the activities and the resources we have in the organization. We start with job design, which is the first building block. So we determine what a person's work-related responsibilities will be. When we look at the entire organization, we have to decide how we want to departmentalize, meaning what activities do we want to put together. We also look at chain of command, who reports to who, and span of management, how many people report to a given supervisor. Authority is the power structure of the organization. Centralization versus decentralization has to do with the decision making that's going on in an organization. And when we refer to tall versus flat organizations, that has to do with how many layers of management we have. Let's start with job design. We have a few elements we're going to look at in regards to job design, and the first one is going to be job specialization. This is the degree to which an overall task is broken down and divided into smaller component parts. There are many advantages or benefits to specialization, but there also are some drawbacks. So let me give you an example of job specialization from when I worked at a fast food restaurant as a teenager. If you go into a fast food restaurant and you order a meal, so you're getting a drink, you're getting, we'll use Burger King as an example because that's where I worked. Maybe you're getting fries and a sandwich, like a chicken sandwich, and a Whopper. The person taking your order does not take your order and then go make each thing individually. They have broken those jobs down so that one person is in charge of making a Whopper, one person is in charge of making the fried food, like the French fries and onion rings, and another person puts together the sandwiches. So that's where specialization can make you more efficient. Workers become very proficient or good and fast at doing whatever task they're doing. The transfer time between tasks is decreased. Like I said, the person that took your order doesn't have to now leave the cash register, go back to where the Whoppers are made, and then go over and put the fries down and shift between these different tasks. Specialized equipment can be made so that things are more efficient as well. And it's also easier to replace employees, because if I've trained someone on how to do just the fry area, for instance, and they leave, I don't have to train someone on how to do everything, just one specific thing. Now, the problem with this is that if we specialize jobs too much and really break them down to a very small amount of work being done that's repetitive, it can be very boring. And we'll find our employees might be very dissatisfied at work because of this boredom. And we don't always get the benefits we thought we might get, when the benefits typically with job specialization is efficiency and productivity. Now let's look at an example. Making a nail required 18 different tasks. If one person were to do all 18 tasks, they'd be able to make 20 nails a day. So if we had 20 workers, 20 times 20 gives us those 400 nails being made. But with specialization, when we break that task down or making the nail down to the 18 separate tasks and assign the 20 workers, we can make 100,000 nails a day, meaning one worker can do 5,000. That's a huge productivity boost. Now think about how simple a nail is, right? There's not much to it. Breaking that down into 18 separate tasks to get it done and having one person maybe do one, at most two of those tasks can be very boring and redundant and cause job dissatisfaction. So if we get to the point where we've made a job so specialized that we see a higher turnover because people don't want to stay in that job, we do have alternatives. So here are the alternatives to job specialization. So we can rotate people through jobs. Job rotation would be systematically moving employees from one job to another in an attempt to reduce that boredom. So when I worked at Burger King, I wouldn't always work on Burger Board or work on Whopper Board. They would rotate through so that you got some variety. Another option is job enlargement. So instead of doing one very specialized job, you might actually have two. So your job actually gets bigger, it enlarges. And then we have job enrichment. I want to make sure you understand the difference between job enlargement and job enrichment. Enrichment not only increases the number of tasks you're doing, but it also increases the control you have over your job. So with job enrichment, you might have more authority or discretion in making decisions about your job. Here's a tool that can be used to also look at job design. This is called the Job Characteristics Approach. It has 5 core dimensions, as we can see. So what you do is you analyze a job based on these 5 dimensions. You look at skill variety, which is how many different tasks do I do in a job. Task identity, the extent to which a worker does a complete or an identifiable portion of a total job. How important we think that task is, which is task significance. How much autonomy that person has in the job, which is how much control they have over how that work is performed. And then also feedback. Do your employees get any feedback on how they're doing in their job? So if we see that we have dissatisfied employees or higher turnover than we want to see or expect, we might want to look at the job by these 5 core dimensions and try and diagnose what the problem is or how we could make the job better. So think about your own jobs. Are you satisfied at your job? Or are you dissatisfied in some way? Think about these different 5 core dimensions of your job and think about which things could be changed to either make you more satisfied and happier with your job. So if I look at my job as a professor, skill variety. Do I do a variety of different tasks? Yeah, I do. I not only teach, I'm creating videos, I'm narrating them, putting them into different technologies. I have to know how to do things online, in the classroom. I need to know how to get the resources I need. So I have a lot of skill variety. Task identity. How do I see that I'm doing a complete job? Well, yeah, I start a semester. On day 1, I meet my students. I do their grades and all their assignments throughout the whole semester, and at the end I enter their final grades. So I do the entire task. Task significance. Do I think what I do is important? Well, I do. I provide an education to my students, right? Task significance is a lot about perception. So if we look at a server, a waiter or a waitress, do they think their task is important? Well, I would argue yes. They could be the difference between someone going out on a Friday night and having a great experience and a terrible experience. If you think about maybe a family or a couple that's going out and has paid for a babysitter and is going out for dinner, that's a lot of money being spent and they might not get out that often. So I think that job is important. So with task significance, it really is up to the manager to make sure people think that what they are doing is important. It is easy to say that a surgeon or a nurse, especially during a crisis, is saving lives, and that's important. But what about an accountant? Accountant has an important job too, if they're saving people money or saving a business money. So significance is about perception. Autonomy, getting back to my job. How much control do I have over my job? I have a lot of control. How I choose to teach is on me, right? And then feedback. How much feedback do I get? Well, I get feedback from my students, either at the end of the semester during student evaluations or throughout the semester, and I also get feedback from my colleagues. So we can look at any job along these 5 core dimensions and try to make it better in some way. It could be one thing that needs to be improved, or it could be a combination of things. You'd be surprised that sometimes just giving people feedback can increase their motivation and their satisfaction with the job, knowing how they're doing in a job. Or autonomy, giving people more freedom in their job, again, can be very rewarding. When we looked at job enlargement and job enrichment, maybe increasing the skill variety or the number of tasks a person has in a job can reduce boredom and also allow them to see that they're completing a whole piece of something. So the task identity is improved as well. Another alternative to specialization when we're talking about job design is to set up work teams. This gives the option of working together on something as opposed to individually, and can also be more satisfying for your employees. Let's move on to departmentalization. This is how we group jobs together. We try to come up with some logical arrangement of jobs, and we're going to look at some different examples. Why do we departmentalize? Well, once an organization grows, it makes sense to group jobs together. If you start a small business and you're running the whole show, you're doing everything. But once you grow larger than what you can handle, you need to put different functions in place so that someone is handling things for you. So let's look at the different bases of a departmentalization. We have functional, product, customer, and location. Functional departmentalization involves grouping the jobs that are similar or the same. And when we talk about functional, we're not talking about the functions of management, we're talking about business function, sort of like the things you go to school for. So we might have a legal department, an HR department, a production department, marketing department. That's functional departmentalization. So in our example of a small business owner growing and needing to hire people to do certain aspects of his business, he might hire someone that now takes over maybe payroll and all the filing requirements for the business. Moving on to product departmentalization. This is where we group activities around the products we sell. So let's look at an example in for an aerospace company. A company like Airbus might have divisions set up for their commercial aircraft, which would be the planes that you and I might take to go on a vacation, a helicopter department or division, defense, as well as space. So defense differs from commercial aircraft because it would be things used by the military in defending the country. And then space would be products like satellites. So these are departments that could be set up by someone in the aerospace industry to departmentalize around their products. Customer departmentalization is going to group the activities around different customer groups. So we could departmentalize based on foreign customers versus domestic customers. So depending on who we're selling to, whether they're within our country or outside our country. Another way to departmentalized by customer might be distinguishing between institutional customers and retail or consumers. For instance, when I worked at my previous job, I was responsible for the investments of all our pension plans, both the pension as well as the 401k plans, and we used Fidelity Investments. Fidelity Investments departmentalized by customer. So they distinguished between me working for the company I worked for and investing all my employees' funds in our plans versus the retail side, where it would be you and me going to Fidelity to open up, say, an individual IRA. Why would we departmentalize based on customer? Well, if we treat customers differently for whatever reason, so if we're distinguishing between foreign and domestic, perhaps it's because we have to treat them differently because of the laws. When we talk about institutional versus retail or consumers, they also provide different services. As an institutional investor for my company, I don't need as much guidance in terms of the investments because I understand them. That's part of my job. But a retail customer trying to open up an IRA might need more information so that they can make an educated decision. Lastly, we have location departmentalization, which is going to be grouping jobs on the basis of where they're located or the geographic site. So it might be referring to areas such as the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, the West Coast, or a specific city where a plant might be located. This slide shows examples of all four types of departmentalization. You should be able to see functional, product, customer, and location. Let's start with the easiest, location. This would be location departmentalization, as would this line and here. We have functional departmentalization on this line here, under both computers and software. Computers and software represent product departmentalization. And lastly, we have customer departmentalization right here, industrial sales and consumer sales. Let's move on to reporting relationships. Here we see chain of command and span of management, also known as span of control. The chain of command is the clear and distinct line of authority among the positions in an organization. If you recall from the first slide, the lines on the organizational chart show that chain of command. And span of management is the number of people who report to a particular manager. These are direct reports. I'll go through this in a little more detail on the next slide. So what is the best number of reports to have to one manager? Well, it depends. It depends on the manager as well as the subordinate. How competent is that manager? If you have a brand new manager, they're not going to be able to handle as many subordinates as a more senior manager. The extent that we have standardized procedures. For example, if we go back to our example of a fast food restaurant, those jobs are pretty specialized. There are procedures for doing each of those jobs, like working the fry station, you know exactly how long the fries go down for. Working any of the other stations, there are standardized procedures. So those employees don't need a lot of supervision, which goes into our next point. How much required interaction is there between the manager and each of the employees? And how much work does that supervisor have to do in addition to managing the employees? This slide goes into a little more detail about what was started on the last slide. Additional things that we didn't already touch on was the physical dispersion of the subordinates. So if a manager is responsible for managing employees at several locations, they're going to have a narrower span of management. So when we talk about the span of management, we refer to it as being either narrow or wide. A wide span of management would have more people reporting to them than a narrow span of management. If the employees are doing very similar tasks, number 6, you can see, we can manage more people because we don't need to know how to do as many things in case they have a problem. Another thing to consider when determining the span of management is the frequency with which new problems are brought to the manager's attention. So if we think of a business like a custom print shop, where each job that's coming in is customized, and perhaps the manager has to approve maybe the pricing or the time frame for getting these jobs done. He can't possibly manage as many people as a business where everything is standardized, so they don't need to get the opinion of the manager or the manager's approval. And lastly, the preference of the supervisors and the subordinates. Some subordinates might need more supervision than others, and some supervisors might not be comfortable managing too many people. So on this slide, we can see a visual of the difference between a tall and flat organization and also a narrow and a wider span of management. So if we look here, we have the president, a level of management, and employees. This is definitely a flat organization. There aren't a lot of layers. Now we can also refer to a flat organization as having 1 or 2 more layers in there, but we can compare these two and see that this one is much taller because we have 1, 2, 3 levels of management before we have employees. But a tall organization might have even more layers in there. So let's look at span of management here. We see in this one, the span of management through this whole organization is 2. Okay? The president has 2 people reporting to them. This position, let's say this is a vice president, has 2 people reporting to them. There's 2 that report here. An important thing I want to point out is that the president doesn't have all the people underneath that position reporting to them. They only have the ones that are directly linked. That's what we mean by direct reports. So now under this, what's the span of management? The president has how many people reporting to them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the span of management for this president is 6. The span of management for this supervisor is 4. When we talk about reporting relationships, we can also talk about authority. Authority is the power that's been legitimized by the organization. When we talk about having direct reports to a manager, that manager, by virtue of being their supervisor, has authority over giving those employees direction. So let's look at what delegation means. This is when a manager assigns a portion of their workload to others. So why would we want to delegate? It's not just to make our jobs easier. It is a way to get more done by using the skills and talents of our subordinates, as well as helping foster the development of our subordinates by having them participate in what's going on in the organization. You might think, oh, I don't want to have something delegated to me, but it's a good opportunity to nurture your employees, teaching them new skills and seeing how they perform, which can help you in terms of maybe promotion, moving them to other areas of your organization. We see that delegation has 3 steps. The first one is where the manager assigns responsibility for some task to the subordinate. What's also important, when we give someone responsibility for something, we also have to give them the authority to carry that out. For instance, if I have a subordinate work on a project that I'm supposed to be working on, I have them and I say, you need to pull the salary information for these employees as you work on this project, but they don't have access to that information. They can't do it. I have to make sure that they've been given the authority to pull the information they need or to get whatever it is they need to do that job. That's granting authority. And once we've granted that authority, they can actually do the work. The last step is to create accountability. This isn't something we can guarantee. This is to make sure, hopefully, that the subordinate actually completes whatever responsibility was given to them. So hopefully, if you're going to be delegating to a subordinate, you have confidence that they will do it. You check up on their progress and get feedback to make sure that whatever's been delegated actually gets done. Because at the end of the day, it was the manager's work that was delegated, and if the work doesn't get done, it's the manager that would be held responsible. So delegation is a win-win. It can free up the manager's time, and it can also help motivate and provide new skills for the subordinate, but it's not without problems. Sometimes managers don't want to delegate. A lot of times it's because they're too disorganized. If I'm going to delegate something to someone, I need to be organized. I have to figure out how to explain this to someone before I can actually hand it off. Perhaps the manager is insecure and is afraid that the subordinate would do a better job than them and threaten their position, or having a lack of trust in the subordinate. I had a manager once say, "Gee, I'm the only one that can do something." Well, that's very degrading to your employees. Subordinates, on the other hand, sometimes don't want to take on a job. If you had a manager tell you that, "I'm the only one that can do it right," I'd be reluctant to take on that delegated job also. Sometimes a subordinate feels like they're just being dumped on. You're just giving the work to get it off your desk. If they don't see any reward for accepting that additional responsibility, they may be reluctant to take it. And again, it's perception. Make them feel like it's important, that they're learning, that there's value to this. And lastly, some employees may prefer to avoid any risk and responsibility. Now let's look at decentralization and centralization. This has to do with how we delegate power and authority in our organization. With decentralization, we systematically delegate power and authority to lower levels of management. By contrast, with centralization, we retain that power at the top for the decision making. The factors that determine our choice of centralization have to do with different elements. First, the history of the organization. Perhaps we've always had a very centralized decision-making structure. That might be very hard to change in our culture. The external environment, whether it's complex or simple, how dynamic it is, also plays a role in our choice of centralization. So consider a business working in a very complex, dynamic environment that's changing constantly, and if we don't adapt quickly, we might fail, go into entropy. So we might, in that case, want to decentralize and put the power and authority for that decision making at lower levels of management where they can adapt more quickly. And lastly, we can look at the nature of the decisions that are being made, the cost and the risk associated with a decision. If it's a very costly decision, or many of them tend to be, or the risk associated with making a bad decision is great and might jeopardize our business, we might want to retain those decisions at the top. Now let's look at how we coordinate activities across our organization. If different departments and work groups depend on one another for information and resources to perform their jobs, we need to coordinate those activities. The greater that interdependence, the greater the need for the coordination. These are the three major forms of interdependence: sequential, reciprocal, and pooled. Pooled is the most simple. The different areas have little interaction with each other. The output of each of these different units is then pulled together for the organization. The example from the book talks about Old Navy. Each store works independently, has its own budget, and at the end of the quarter, end of the year, the profits from each of the individual stores are pooled for the parent company. With sequential interdependence, the inputs going into this first area become the output that comes out becomes the input for the next area. So this work can't start until this work has been completed. Example would be any kind of manufacturing facility where we need part done before we can move on to the second part. For instance, if you're making an automobile, you can't finish production until the engine is done and it gets put in the car and then it moves its way through. Lastly, we have reciprocal. With reciprocal interdependence, activities flow both ways between the units. Example from the book talked about a hotel, where the reservations department, the front desk check-in, and housekeeping all are reciprocally interdependent. If a new guest checks in, housekeeping has to be made aware of it, make sure the rooms are available for the next guests that arrive. Lastly, let's differentiate between positions. We have line positions and staff positions. Line positions are those positions in the direct chain of command, responsible for achieving the organization's goals. This is where we see formal, otherwise known as legitimate authority. So when we look back at an organizational chart, the lines connecting the boxes represent those line positions, okay, the direct chain of command. Staff positions, on the other hand, are not part of the direct line of command. They are positions intended to provide expertise, advice, and support to those line positions. They have authority, but it's not formal authority, it's advisory authority. They can give compulsory advice. Makes more sense with an example. So let's think about the HR department. If you're doing a search to hire a new employee, the HR department, and you're not in the HR department, the HR department is going to give you advice on how you're going to handle that search. So even though you don't report to them, they can force you to follow the direction they've given you because of their area of expertise. So they have functional authority to enforce compliance with organizational policies and procedures.